Good evening. Welcome to St. Clement's and Ewell. I'm Father Alexander. This is A to Z of Catholicism, and F is for free will. Now, one of the things is tomorrow Parliament is going to be voting on the so-called Assisted Dying or Assisted Suicide Act. And so therefore free will, what constitutes free will, is very much an actual topic for us all. Freedom of will essentially means freedom of choice, freedom to do A and reject B, to do good and to reject evil. The assisted dying debate has thrown a bit of light onto what it actually means to make a free and rational choice. In this case, the free and rational choice to kill yourself. We are told that there are some people who have decided, because they're living with impossible pain and because they're going to die anyway very soon, or so they assume, that they wish to make a choice to end their lives, and that therefore, if that is their free and rational choice, their personal choice, we have no right to stand in their way. However, what looks like a free and rational choice may not necessarily be so. Our freedom as human beings is quite often circumscribed by hidden influences. And nobody actually can deny that. I mean, think of it this way. British people have a way of thinking. American people have a way of thinking. And the two are really very different. I mean, if you said to English people, have you got a gun? They'd look at you crazily. They think, what? If you said to an American, have you got a gun? And they say, yeah, I got 6 or whatever. Or no, I haven't, but my auntie's got 3. And so, that sort of thing. Our culture, their culture, completely different. The choices we make are completely different because the choices we make are informed by our culture. So, for example, I would never choose to have a gun. I just would never choose to have a gun. I regard guns with horror, but that's because I'm British. If I had been born in America, I'd probably think completely differently. And I might think, oh, well, yes, I'll choose to get a gun, and that'd be a rational choice. To me, buying a gun would be completely, I mean, if ever you saw me going out to buy a gun, I really do hope you'd all jump on me and stop me at once, because it would be actually completely correct to say he's gone mad. I mean, but in America, owning a gun and keeping it at home, it's not a sign that you're barking mad. Here it is, I think. Has anybody here, do you know anybody who owns a gun? What, in Britain? Americans in Britain own guns? Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, people in Durham have shotguns. We're reliably informed. Okay, yeah. No, actually, the people who own guns in Britain are farmers. Farmers have guns, but they need them. They need them. That's normal. Landowners need guns to shoot rabbits and things like that. Anyway, okay. Now, our freedom is informed by our culture. It's as simple as that. If you're thinking of committing suicide because you're in great pain, the pain may influence us and stop us thinking clearly, it seems to me. And if you're in pain, you might choose to do certain things or want to do certain things that you would never want to do if you weren't in pain, if your mind was clear. And quite often we have to say to people who are on the verge of making bad decisions, you're not thinking straight. Or you have to say, well, listen, let's leave it for a bit and let's come back, tomorrow morning and think about it. And we have to do that. That's normal. That's just a normal part of life. And the other thing about us, the people around us may not say anything, but you know what they're thinking, you know what they want you to do, and you might feel that you might just feel, oh, for a peaceful life, I'd better do it. And they're not necessarily killing yourself, but it might be something like giving up your car, selling your house, or whatever. You know what they're thinking. They're not saying anything, but by the very fact that they're not saying something, they are communicating. The fact, oh, she never says what she's thinking, but I know what she's thinking, and so on and so forth. So without a word being spoken, people can be pressurized by other people to do whatever it is. There may be hidden coercion. And there's also self-coercion. I don't want to do this, but I feel I have to because I feel it's what everybody around me would expect. And I think with assisted dying, the suicide will become very much an option for people will say, well, you know, left to my own devices, I wouldn't do it. But obviously my children, etc., and other people around me, they want me to do this, I feel. They haven't said anything, but I can tell what they're thinking, so I better do it. Lady Warnock of my university, she said, old people have a duty to die. She's quite old herself. I think she might have actually died herself. I'm not sure. Yeah, Mary Warnock, who was the great moral guru of our times about 20 or 30 years ago. She was in charge of several government reports on ethical matters. So when you have people like Lady Warnock saying old people have a duty to die, you sit at home thinking, oh my God, does she mean me? Uh, and the pressure is there. Our society pressurizes people. Now, we don't exist as independent of society. And we need to be aware of how society forms us. And we have to be, as Christians, we're called to be countercultural. We've got to go against many of the trends of society. They're all walking in this direction. Sometimes we have to go against the flow. We've got to walk in the opposite direction to the way everybody else is walking. This is really very important. I don't know if you've ever seen that excellent photograph of a whole load of people giving the Hitler salute. It was taken in Germany in the time of Hitler. A whole load of people giving the Hitler salute with great enthusiasm. There's one bloke in the middle of the crowd looking really cheesed off, pointedly not giving the Hitler salute. Now, he must have been a bit of an oddity in those days. I don't know what happened to him, but he's now a hero, that guy, whoever he was, because he did not go with the flow. When the flow is heading towards a cliff, not going with the flow is the best thing to do. But being that countercultural will be incredibly difficult. Now, we'll get on to Hitler in a moment, because I think most talks on theology eventually get back to Hitler, don't they? Now, a sin. If you commit a sin, the sin has got to be an act of you freely entered into with full knowledge. So something like blowing your nose cannot possibly be a sin because, or sneezing cannot be a sin because sneezing is completely involuntary. Having an epileptic fit is completely involuntary. Let's say you didn't know you were an epileptic, but you have an epileptic fit in your car and you run somebody over. You're not to blame. You had no idea you were an epileptic. If you were an epileptic and you knew you were an epileptic and you would be not taking your pills or whatever and you ran somebody over because you had an epileptic fit in your car, you would be to blame because you should have known better. You should have acted differently. Now, Adam and Eve, in that famous story, Genesis 2, know exactly what they're doing because they've been told by God. That Genesis story is sort of like a laboratory. They're in the garden, which is a sort of laboratory conditions. God has told them in no uncertain terms, do not eat the fruit of that tree. Then along comes this talking snake, and they look at the tree, she looks at the tree and sees it's good to eat and it's desirable, and so on and so forth. And she stretches forth her hand and she takes the fruit. She's been told. She entered it, she cannot. Then, of course, she gives it to her husband. And then, of course, God says, what have you been doing? Have you been eating of the fruit I told you not to eat of? And the man says, it was the woman you put with me. She gave it to me and I ate it. In other words, your fault, and it's her fault. It's nothing to do with me. And the woman said, it wasn't me, it was a snake who tempted me and I ate. And so you get this cascade of blame. That, of course, is another thing about free will. If we do things freely, then we need to own our actions. We've got to say, yes, I freely did this. This is my action. I cannot pass on the responsibility to other people. Free will means responsibility for what I've done. Now, they were in fact free. Nowadays, people are not very free. At least I don't think they are. First of all, people don't have a profound knowledge of what is right and what is wrong. So when they see something up ahead, which they may or may not do, they're not really aware that what is wrong is really, really wrong. They might say, oh, well, people regard that as wrong, but it's not, you know, the circumstances, etc., really determine whether it's right or wrong, and so on and so forth. Let's take a really good example. There are lots of people in this country, I've been told, who are regular ingesters of cocaine. Isn't this the case? Yes, it is the case. It is the case. What these people don't seem to realize, by ingesting cocaine, they are keeping in business criminal gangs with private armies who are murdering thousands of people, usually in Latin America, but also in other places, and causing mayhem and misery for thousands and thousands, indeed millions of people. Because don't forget, the cocaine trade has reduced many countries to ungovernability because the governments declared war on drugs, and of course then they lost the war on drugs. And then you get the emergence of narco states, such as, for example, Mexico is a narco state. And how many hundreds of thousands of people are killed every year in Mexico? Hundreds and thousands. So this, but people say, oh, well, it's just an instant pleasure, me having a bit of cocaine. No, it's not. It's blood-stained pleasure. But they don't understand or choose not to understand how these things are connected. Um, or they might just be followers of the crowd. Everybody's doing it. Oh, it must be okay if everybody's doing it. Obviously, our grandparents wouldn't have done it, but we do it, and therefore, if everybody's doing it, it can't possibly be wrong. Now, that is a very weak argument, I have to say. And also, their real problem is that they are amoral rather than immoral. They can't recognize good and evil, so you can't really say they're making a choice for evil when they don't really have the ability to tell the difference between good and evil. Now, here we get to that passage from Dante. Um, Dante is walking along, it's in Canto 3 of Purgatorio, no, of Hell, of l'Inferno, and he's walking along with his guide, Virgil, and what happens is they see all these people screaming, and he said, these are those who lived without praise and without infamy. And they didn't make the choice for evil or the choice for good. They just sort of were neutral. And then he says, non ragionam di lor, ma guarda e passa. Let's not talk about them. Just look and pass on. And this is possibly the vast majority of our contemporaries. They haven't made a choice to do evil, but they haven't made a choice to do good either. They just bumble along. They are not man enough to be damned. And of course, if we go back to Hitler, the 1930s in Germany, a lot of people just sort of decided they didn't want to know. Oh, well, you know, it's the government, you know, oh, I know there are bad things going on, but I've chosen not to know. And and so the Hitler was able to do what he did with the active collaboration of about 300,000 people, but with the passive collaboration of about 30 million people. You know, they just sort of said, oh, well, it's nothing to do with us. Oh, yeah, you know, maybe, well, it's a difficult question. And people say the same today about lots of things that are going on today, which are incredibly evil, but they just pass it by. The fact that euthanasia is going on in our country, it's been going on in our country for clandestinely, I should imagine, for some considerable time. A lot of people just turn a blind eye to that. Okay, now, but those people who are not man enough to be damned, they are certainly have done wrong in that they had a duty to reflect properly on the questions of life, and they didn't reflect properly. Now, if you're created free, you're responsible for your actions, and you have a duty to reflect on what it is you have to do. That is very important, I think. Now, and you've got to have, in other words, consciousness of who you are, a person in the world who is faced by moral choices. You can't just bumble through life. You've got to make choices. So you've got to have that consciousness, and not all choices are good. And then secondly, what you've got to do, you've got to have a conscience which is rightly informed and which chooses good and rejects evil. The idea that you can go through life with never consulting your conscience because you'll never need to is simply not true. We've all got consciences. Sometimes we've anesthetized them, put them to sleep, but we've got consciences and we need to consult them regularly. Okay, now, if we're not guided by our consciences and our consciousness, well, what is going to guide us? Well, what's going to guide us is the dictatorship of the mob, the crowd, or our appetites, or our emotions. And those would be the three candidates to guide us. Now, the ancient Greeks had this idea of the charioteer. The charioteer was the guy with the reins in the chariot, and he had two horses in front of him. And he was the one, the horses were full of energy and full of passion, and he guided the horses so that the chariot went forward under control. Now, the horses are the passions, and the charioteer is the reason. And so the Greeks said, your reason must guide your appetites and your passions. And therefore, if anybody did anything wrong in ancient Greece, people would say, oh, you're being unreasonable. Now, we don't, that's a useful way of looking at things, but for us, the conscience is what should guide us, and our appetites should lead us towards what is good. We should have an appetite to what is good. We're more than just reason. We are passion as well, and our passion and our reasons both need to be attracted spontaneously to the good things. But it's true, you know, what the Greeks say, don't let your passions run away with you. Don't let your passions and your appetites run away with you. Do not become a creature, a slave to your passions or a slave to your appetites, because then you'll lose your free will. Now we're living in a very difficult age, are we not? In that there are several quite malign forces that try to seduce us away from our free will and enslave us through our passions. Number one is advertising. Eat this piece of chocolate; it's delicious, making you a slave into your appetite for chocolate. That's really straightforward. Well, it won't be so bad, I think, if you become a chocoholic, but it's not so necessarily a great thing either. But again, advertising for alcohol. Do we still have advertising for alcohol on British television? Yeah, okay. Do you remember that rubbish, Hirondelle and Les Français adorent le Piat d'Or, which isn't actually sold in France, by the way, because it's disgusting French wine just for the British market. Um, this idea of getting people to drink more. Do we really need to encourage people to drink more? Probably not. I think they'll drink enough as it is, you know. But this idea of leading people on, that's really bad. The other thing that's a malign influence, oh, and incidentally, getting you to buy stuff you don't need. You know, look at poor old Imelda Marcos. How many pairs of shoes did she have? 2,000. How many did she need? One. And yet, presumably, she'd been seduced by advertising for shoes. She couldn't resist saying, oh, I just have another pair. You don't need 2,000 pairs of shoes. But every shoemaker in the world would love you to have 2,000 pairs of shoes. They really would. Salvatore Ferragamo loved Imelda Marcos and vice versa. Okay, the other thing is we're really malign nowadays. A really malign thing is social media. It can be used for good, but it's also very, very harmful, particularly harmful for the young and the impressionable. That means children and teenagers, children of 11 and 9 and 10 and so on and so forth. Because here you get mob rule. So it projects certain things such as you've got to be thin, or you've got to be beautiful in this way, or you've got to be, oh, I don't know what it is because I'm not a teenager, I'm no longer a child. But it puts enormous pressure on people to conform to a certain way of being. And some of them cannot conform to that certain way of being and are victimized by their contemporaries, their peer group, and some, as we know, have ended up committing suicide. I mean, it is true, isn't it? There are quite a lot of children and teenagers who committed suicide. We've and also older children, young adults as well, who have done stuff and then have been um, subjected to online victimization, have gone and killed themselves. And we do know, don't we, that young adults are at a vulnerable age. So this is very, very wrong. Um, it is the mob mentality, which, of course, if you remember, the mob mentality was very much something the ancient Romans were aware of. Virgil was certainly aware of the Roman mob. It means vulgus mobile, the movable crowd. In Rome, in the city of Rome, there were thousands of people who had no proper employment and just went out in the streets to make trouble. They appear as a major part of the drama in Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare. But this was a major thing in Rome, and pacifying the mob was a major thing. And of course, the Romans, aristocrats, despised the mob because they were unreasonable and they were the dregs of society, but above all because they were unreasonable. And then, of course, the mob came out again as a major player in the French Revolution. And even nowadays, it's come back through Twitter. The Twitter mob. Um, and this is not a good way of making decisions because on our own, we can deliberately use our free will. But it seems once we're part of a crowd, we lose our ability to exercise free will as individual people. Now, addiction is a major thing these days, isn't it? And that undoubtedly comes, an addict loses their free will. Yes. Ish. They start off with free will and gradually it whittles away. And when somebody is in the last stages of alcoholism, as I do know a few people who are, it's very, I mean, with some people, speaking from personal experience, there comes a time when you think, the 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 the, the direction of travel has been set and it's not going to change now. When somebody gets to a certain age, sometimes they're in their 60s or even their 70s, you think it's too late for him to turn. The Titanic is heading towards the iceberg and it's too late to do a reformation of life. Yeah. I'm a bit of a liberal on this one, in that I would say it is weakness. Yes, but the weakness has become such a habit that the strength to overcome the weakness has simply disappeared. They can overcome it, and they should overcome it, and they would save themselves a hell of a lot of trouble if they overcame it, and the people around them. But the more it goes on, the less likely it is that they will overcome it. And I think, once, I mean, I'm thinking one of the alcoholics I know who had every advantage in life. And why throw that away? It is a moral weakness. I don't buy this idea that it's a disease. It is hereditary. It might be genetic. What I do think is that it is a moral weakness, and everybody's got a moral weakness. If you've got a weakness for alcohol, then you need to steer clear or be aware of your weakness and manage it. It's a failure to manage your appetites. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah, yeah. The good points here. Yeah, yeah. I think that the thing is when somebody drinks too much, alcoholism means your drinking is a problem to yourself or towards other people. That's the new working definition. It does clearly change your physical nature, and your body does, like tobacco, your body does cry out for a drink. You say, oh my God, I'm dying for a drink. And again, I used to smoke, and there would be a time when you were dying for a cigarette, and you do become physically dependent, but it's also a mental dependence and it becomes harder and harder to break. We are creatures of habit, and what we need to do is cultivate good habits, which are called virtues, and try to put to death bad habits, which are called vices. I mean, there are lots of bad habits that are not as catastrophic as alcoholism. Alcoholism is a catastrophically bad habit. It's certainly true that there are physiological things to do with it. For example, alcoholism is much, much more common in certain races than others. So the single, do you know which race it is that are most prone to alcoholism? I'm not looking at you, it's sort of in a meaningful way. What, who? No. uh, Native Americans, Native Americans, and I think possibly also members of the Aboriginal community in Australia. Now, but this again is also cultural because the Native Americans didn't have any alcohol until the whites turned up in America, and the Aborigines didn't have any alcohol until the whites turned up, and therefore they hadn't built up a resistance to it. And the building up of a resistance to it in the community is something that takes many hundreds of years. I think that's, I think that would be roughly true. What the Holy Father calls the terrorism of gossip. Yeah, yeah. 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 There comes a time with habitual offending against whatever commandment of God it might be, when really the person is no longer culpable because they've lost their free will. Now, and then you could talk about this person has got a gossip disorder, or they've got an eating disorder, or whatever. Now, one thing, let's say eating disorders, something like bulimia and anorexia, they seem to me to be morally neutral. That maybe it started off in some way as culpable, but by the time with anorexia, it's not a moral problem; it's a medical problem. And similarly, I would say drug addiction is not a moral problem once it's firmly established; it's a medical problem. It's no point sending drug addicts to jail. What they need is treatment. What's really worrying is that the treatment of drug addicts is exceptionally expensive and the actual success rate is tiny. Well, it has to be done, hasn't it? But I don't think you can tell drug addicts you are bad people, and that's why you're a drug addict. You've got to say, well, hang on, you're just like anybody else, but you had a weakness in this regard, and now it's gone out of hand. Let's see what we can do to try and ameliorate the situation or to cure you. Yeah. Oh, what, by me or by them? Oh, yes. If we talk about a movement that I admire, AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, when you go to AA, which needless to say, I'm not an alcoholic, so I've never been, you say, hello, my name's Clive, and I'm an alcoholic. And everybody sort of goes, cheers and so on and so forth. Not because it's great you're an alcoholic. Yeah, no, it's not because, far from it, it's not because it's great that you're an alcoholic. You have admitted your responsibility for your actions, and that's the first step onto being cured. Because I'm an alcoholic because my mother was so awful to me. No, sorry, love, it wasn't her fault. You are the alcoholic. You own up to being an alcoholic. And funnily enough, the 12-step program in AA has got a fairly reasonable success rate, and it's certainly a better success rate than anything else. So it's all power to their elbow. And of course, then there's the sort of spin-offs. There's Narcotics Anonymous and Cocaine Anonymous and things like that. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Mm, mm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. The only person who can help you is you. I think it's very. I mean, I've dealt with unreformed alcoholics, and they're incredibly manipulative and this, that, the other. And you just got to say to them, "You're an alcoholic." No, I'm not. I just like a drink. No, you're an alcoholic. Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, probably. Um, the thing is, we've talked about free will, responsibility. I own my own actions, and what was the third thing we talked about? Conscientious thought and deliberation about how I'm going to exercise the free will. And of course, one of the things that the alcoholic wants to get away from is the burden of conscience. I'll have a drink and I'll feel better because it will anesthetize my mind and it will, but much more important, it will anesthetize my heart. An alcoholic is essentially, in my humble opinion, like a drug addict, somebody who doesn't want to face up to the fact that life can be what life is. It can be pretty bloody boring on a cold, wet Monday morning in Ewell. But you know what? A cold, wet Monday morning in Ewell is an awful lot where you're fully conscious, is an awful lot better than being half cut or being an alkie or whatever. One of the things that's really worrying, of course, and this I think proves my point, is that the real problem is the addictive personality and the flight from reality. In Brighton and Hove, people have pioneered this new method of being alcoholics and drug addicts at the same time. So when you can't get drugs, you have alcohol. When you can't get alcohol, you have drugs, which is awful, awful, awful. And then, of course, we've got the I do feel sorry for people who fall into the addiction of OxyContin because OxyContin is incredibly addictive, and you really it's not you're not to blame if you were prescribed by a doctor to take the stuff in the first place, and then suddenly you discover you're addicted. I mean, that's appalling, isn't it? And but it's interesting to note that OxyContin addiction is more prevalent in some places than others. So it's something that you discover in West Virginia rather than Western Surrey. I mean, that's the way it is, isn't it? But there are lots of OxyContin addicts in Britain. It's it's a pretty horrible thing. Now, okay, but one of the things is be aware of what you're doing. So anyway, now let's get to a bit of theology because this is very much in the realm of, I suppose, philosophy. The Protestants believe, remember them, uh, they believe that, or they believed, the Protestant reformers believed that Adam and Eve sinned irreparably, broke their relationship off with God, and were therefore expelled from the Garden of Eden and were cast into outer darkness, and original sin ruined them profoundly. The Catholics believe original sin was a bad thing, but it was by no means the disaster that the Protestants said it was. Now, this is incredibly important um, because we Catholics believe that even though human beings are sinners, we can still do good in the world and we can still love our neighbor, even if we don't believe in God. So, this means, for example, people who've never heard of God, such as, or the Catholic God, or Jesus Christ, such as people, let's say, those guys who, or maybe they were women, who painted those caves in Altamira in Spain. Have you ever seen photographs of those cave paintings? You must look it up on Google. They are the most amazingly beautiful things you've ever seen. There's hunting scenes in a deep, deep cave in Spain. And this was the time, do you remember this? These children went down to the caves and they discovered the caves with candles. And one said, "What can you see?" And he said, "Toros, toros." bulls. They are astonishingly beautiful, and they're how old? 5,000 years old, or 3,000 years old, or and these people knew nothing about revelation, about religion and Jesus Christ and so on. They had some religion, I'm sure, but they were capable of the very highest achievement in the human sphere, and that is valuable. Now, that's really important. Now, if you look at the 39 Articles of Religion, when you in the Anglican Prayer Book, it says good works done before salvation, something of sin. They smell of sin or something. They taste of sin. In other words, there are no good works before salvation. Because once you are saved, then you can do good works. But an unsaved person cannot do good works. This is nonsense. And it's very damaging for people to be told you are rubbish because you don't believe in God. And you now need to start saying, Jesus is my personal savior. Then we can start talking. But no, before you say Jesus is your personal savior, you are able to do good and to enjoy good things like getting married. All the people who've never heard of God who got married and had happy lives, they were blessed by God. They didn't realize, but they were blessed by God. Now, that is important. So humanity is damaged by sin, but not ruined by sin. And there's a distinction between mortal sin and venial sin. Now, mortal sin is a sin that wrecks your relationship with God. Okay, fine. The breaking of the pipe, the water's no longer getting through. Venial sin is it's like a kink in the hose pipe. It doesn't wreck the hose pipe. The hose pipe is still working, but it damages the hose pipe. And we know this happens because we have the letter of St. John to tell us. And the first letter of St. John, chapter 4, verse 17. He says, 16, 17, not those who commit a deadly sin, for there is a sin that is death, says St. John. So you commit a sin and that's it, you're finished. Okay? And I will not say that you must pray about that. Every kind of wrongdoing is sin, but not all sin is deadly. So if you commit murder, that would probably be a deadly sin with malice aforethought, etc. But if you go home and you kick the cat because you're in a bad temper, that's a bad thing to do, but it's not meaning you're beyond the pale of redemption. And yes, but the person who commits murder, let's say, a deadly sin, then has to go to God and say, "I'm sorry," going to confession and so on. They go to confession if they're not 100% sorry to top up their sorriness. But a person who just kicks the cat, or wants to kick the cat, shall we say, is somebody who has not broken their relationship with God, still in the relationship with God. Then that would not be a sin if you were forced. If you have no agency, you can't commit sin. Well, if you're being forced to do something, but you have the free agency to refuse to do it, then you're not being forced. Now, I'll give you an example. When people were, yeah, let's have this was used. This came up quite a lot in the Second World War. People were locked up by the Germans, and what would happen? I know somebody who was locked up by the Germans. He became a priest later, and he was a prisoner of war. And he said that certain people fraternized with the Germans. They did not have to do that, but they did it to get food. And apparently, and this was actually very common, that people would fraternize with the Germans to get food. Now, you've got a bit of a moral problem here. This is what's called a moral dilemma. Do I starve and not fraternize with the Germans, or do I fraternize with the Germans in an immoral way in order to keep myself alive? So, in other words, I have to say, would you become a prostitute to stay alive? Ask yourself. A lot of people do, funnily enough. A lot of people do. But would you do that to stay alive? Or would you say, now, if you remember those boys who were importuned, that's a good word for you to remember, importuned by the Kabaka of Baganda, the king of Uganda, and they said, no way are we doing that, and who were tortured to death because he lost his temper. The Ugandan martyrs, would they, faced with, which would you do? Defend your chastity or give in and stay alive? So it's quite a difficult one, that. Again, St. Thomas More, should he have just sort of put his fingers like that behind us and said, I'll swear whatever you want me to swear, as long as I can stay alive? And the fact of the matter is, if he'd said, oh, I'll take the oath, saying that Henry VIII is head of the church, he wouldn't have been executed. Same with St. John Fisher. I mean, and an awful lot of Catholics decided, oh, well, you know, he's the king, we better do anything for a quiet life, including his own daughter, who he threatened to have her executed. And she was prevailed upon, having consulted her friends, she was prevailed upon to take the oath, and she took the oath, much to her distress. And she took the oath with her, I think she wrote out the thing first of all and posted it off to the Pope saying, I'm going to take the oath, but I don't mean it, and so on and so forth. That you can get round it that way. But becoming a prostitute to save your life, that's not so easy, is it? You can't sort of write a letter to the Pope and say, you know. But a lot of people do. A lot of people become prostitutes because they're too lazy to do anything else. But a lot of people become prostitutes to feed themselves and actually to feed their children, which is one of the saddest things of all. And their addiction. Yes, you also feed their addiction. Now, that is obviously quite wrong. To feed the addiction, that's another thing, isn't it? Gosh, help us, what a world we live in. Now, so John says there's a venial sin. Not all sins are deadly, but some sins are deadly. There was talking of drug-addicted prostitutes, there was this, when Pope Francis went to New York City, he met all these people, and there was this woman who got up and she said, my name's, Mary Ann, or something, or something, something. I'm the mother of 3 children. I am a prostitute and I am a child of God, which is good. Yeah. So I think we need to remember that. People make terrible catastrophical errors because they weren't thinking, or because they were in poor circumstances, or they were just plain Mary Magdalene. Well, we don't know about Mary Magdalene because she's been conflated with the woman who was a sinner. Yeah, or they were just not thinking, or they were just stupid, or they were just lazy. And that is what happens. And their free will eventually goes out of the window. But they have a distant memory of their free will, and they remember what it was like to have had a free will, and they long to have their free will back. And maybe very slowly they're creeping back to regaining their free will. Now, incidentally, we praise what is good in human beings. There is such a thing called the natural good. Human beings are capable of good, even because of their free will, even without the help of God, even though without the explicit help of God. The Protestants say, oh no, it's got to be explicitly Christian to have any merit. It's untrue. Human things, by being human, can have merit by being authentically human. Incidentally, Professor Dawkins's heresy, one of his many heresies, because Professor Dawkins, he's really sort of got a religion going, hasn't he? The religion of no God. He said in one of his books, the most stupid thing I've ever read, said, if people arrive from another planet, the first thing they would ask you is, have you discovered the theory of evolution? And Professor Dawkins' idea is that the theory of evolution represents the highest form of human achievement, and anything that before then seems to be the Dark Ages. This is not true. The people who built the pyramids hadn't got a clue about evolution. The people who painted those cave paintings didn't have a clue about evolution. The Greeks and the Romans, who were capable of such amazing things, didn't know about evolution at all. In other words, scientific enlightenment, there is no, the idea that we need an enlightenment in order to become good people is not true. There is a good life to be had, which is unscientific. Just as there's a good life to be had, which is not explicitly religious. It's strange that a religious person should be telling you this, but this is the case. It really is the case. So let's go back to Adam and Eve, and then we will end. Good Lord, have I been talking that long? Um, the devil came down to tempt Adam and Eve because the devil wanted to enslave them to sin. Jesus Christ has come to save us from the slavery of sin so we may be truly free and we may choose the good and reject evil. The person who chooses evil becomes a slave to sin. And the human being is, by the grace of God, called to live a free life through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Romans 5:5. The Spirit of God has been poured into our hearts, says St. Paul. And if the Spirit of God is poured into our hearts, then we will live freely and we will live truly Christian lives, exercising our free will. God does not want us to be coerced by sin or the devil. And it's wrong to think, finally, I'll choose off another group of people. It's wrong to assume that religious belief is submissive of its nature. As you know, Islam means submission. God is not asking anybody to submit to him. God is asking people to believe in him and to achieve their full stature as human beings. Now, it strikes me, he's not, this idea that he's telling you what to do is simply false. Rather, you've got free will and you've got a conscience. He's asking you to recognize what is the right thing to do and for you to do that right thing off your own bat, thanks to the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Now, there's one final thing. It says in the first chapter of Genesis, so this idea that obedience is the greatest virtue is simply not true. It really is. And submission is not a virtue. Submission is contrary to human dignity. Nobody is asking you to submit to anybody. Is that clear? Wives, he does say wives be obedient to your husbands and so on and so forth. I know. That's been misinterpreted. Be a submissive wife or be a submissive subject of the government. No, tell the government when they're wrong. And God is, we're in partnership with God, I think is how I would see it, rather than we are inclined to submit to God. Now, God said, where is it? God made man in the image of himself. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. What's it mean to be we're created in the image of God? Surely that's a reference to our free will. God is free will, one who freely wills our good, who wills the good for everybody. And we too are made in the image of God. We're not like the animals. The animals don't have free will. They've got instinct. God bless them, they're sweet, but they don't have free will. You can't reason with a dog or a cat. You can't. You really just can't. You say, no, why don't we go for a walk in that direction today? No, it's already run off anyway. It just, it's good, but our free will is part of our human dignity. This is why, I could go on for some time. This is why slavery is a bad thing and a great sin, because you're violating the free will of somebody and taking away their personal autonomy, their self-rule. Self-rule is what God has given us. And that's really impossible because we're made in his image and likeness. We have autonomy, which means self-rule. And how many of you, you've got a teenager. And you sometimes you have to say to the teenager, look, well, what do you think? Are you able to sort this out yourself? Because why are you always coming to me and asking me to sort it out? You have got to sort it out. You're prophet, priest, and king. You sort it out. Grab your autonomy. Don't expect mummy or daddy to come and do it. You are autonomous. My mother said this to me when I was about 6. So they said, God has given us autonomy. Let's live as autonomous human beings, having freedom. Okay. I've been talking for 49 minutes. Have we got any questions? Oh. Hmm. Yeah. One of the things I remember when I was at the university, the Gregorian University in Rome, we had lots of people who gave us lectures. One of them gave us a lecture, and he asked a very important question. This is one of the few things that stayed with me. What is your picture of God? Do you see God as a lawgiver? I suppose if you were Jewish, you would say, yes, I see God as a lawgiver. However, you would rapidly go on to say, and the law that he has given us is for our good. It is an act of love. The law is love. Um, a Christian would say that as well. God is a lawgiver, but the law he gives us is a law of love. And he gives us the law because he loves us. Do you see God as a judge, or God who is always trying to catch you out? That would not be particularly Christian. Do you see God as Father Christmas? Somebody, if you don't behave, he's not going to give you nice things, which is what a lot of people think, actually. Or do you see God as somebody who is demanding your submission, which, as I say, is a mistaken view of God? Do you see God as, this is a little bit more technical, as immanent or transcendent? Which means, do you see God as somebody who is somebody, a personality, somebody who is active in this world? Or do you see God as somebody who is way beyond this world, dwelling in unapproachable light? And this world is all that is not God. God is beyond this world. He is ineffable. He cannot be spoken about in terms of this world. Now, so for example, a totally transcendent vision of God is common amongst Protestants. It's common amongst it's very common amongst it is the thing amongst Muslims. An immanent idea of God. God is here in this world, so he's in my marriage or whatever it is, and so on. Is very common amongst Jews, very common amongst Catholics, and also very common amongst Hindus. And it's a very big division, that, I think. Now, what was your question? Yes, I mean, so yes, like, what is our image of God? What is our God is in the world. God is in the wagging tail of the dog. God sent that dog to wag its tail to make you feel happy. Whereas, of course, for some people, dogs are haram, aren't they? In Judaism, there are elements of the transcendent, but if you read the Jewish scriptures, the transcendent, I mean, some of it, I mean, you do have a bit of a problem in Judaism, sort of in the sense that you're told that dogs are unclean. How could God have created something unclean? It's not a, like what? Dogs. Yeah, I mean, you've got a big problem there. It's God made the Garden of Eden. So why on earth did he put the serpent in it? Yeah, I know. Because no, but the reason is because the author put the serpent in. Because it's a parable. It's a parable, and the parable is saying everything's perfect, but oh God, I'm not entirely happy with perfection. Give them perfection, and they're still not happy. That is what it's telling us. So there we are. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Um, we can't. Yes, we can't find total happiness uh, on earth. Our fulfillment will come in heaven, but we can be pretty fulfilled on earth. That's, I mean, for example, okay, um, I'm sure there's better sculptures in heaven than those of Michelangelo. But for the moment, I think Michelangelo is perfection. And the fact that Michelangelo might have, liked to drink or whatever it was, I don't know. Did I ever tell you about that famous artist whose great work is not very far from here? Have any of you been to Hayes? No, Hayes and Harlington. Hey, it's somewhere near Heathrow Airport. There was this really great artist who was called Pietro Annigoni. He was a Florentine, and he was the one who did the very, very, very famous picture of the Queen in the garter robes. It's the greatest picture of the Queen ever painted, and it was also it's the greatest picture of its time. And Annigoni was an Italian and a Catholic, and every morning when he was in Hayes, he went to the priests in Hayes and I want to paint a painting for your altar. Painted it in situ in church, and it's a picture of his wife. It's the Immaculate Conception with the face of his wife. It's worth a fortune. Um, it's a great picture. I've never seen it, but you can look it up on the internet. And every morning, the priest would say, "Is there anything we can do for you?" He said, "Yes. Would you like a cup of coffee?" When he turned up for work a day, no, he said, "I'd like a litre of red wine." And sort of by 10 o'clock, he'd like another one. And he said, all I want to do is believe in God, but I can't. And it's just like that other guy. Was it Lord McAlpine, who lived in Venice? Very famous, very rich man. He used to go to Mass in Venice, and he'd just go to Mass, and he said, "It's so beautiful, but I can't believe it. All I want to do is believe, but I can't." And that's extraordinary, isn't it? I just find that extraordinary. So there's so much beauty in the world, and yet somehow I can't make that last step. I think Annigoni was a great guy. I mean, he was obviously dealing with demons, hence the sort of 2 litre or litre of wine at 8 o'clock in the morning. But the painting is a great painting. He lived and breathed the Florentine Renaissance sort of tradition, but he couldn't bring himself to believe in God. He couldn't. He couldn't. The other guy who said that is W. Somerset Maugham. If you've seen a child die of meningitis, you cannot believe in God, he said. And Somerset Maugham, when you read his books, it's so obvious that everything is there for belief in God except the one thing, actual belief. Yes. Mm. Yes, yeah, yeah, absolutely. This is the big debate. Bad things certainly happen. All I would say is the bad things that happen were infinitely worse if there was no God. Yeah, and that's why I believe in God. I think the best argument for God is the two guys in the First World War, and one's obviously having a whinge, and the other one says, well, "If you know a better shell hole, go to it." I mean, if you know a better shell hole, go to it. But I think that's the best argument for the belief in God. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I think what you say is I don't know. Hmm. God didn't make he didn't make a mechanical world. I mean, it's a somehow or another. I think you'd have to say how old was your child when he died? 8 years old. At least you had the child for 8 years, is what I would say. Or after many conversations over several weeks, is what I would say. Better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Yes, yeah. Yeah, we're precious. Yeah. Gordon Brown is a good example of somebody who thinks quite deeply and who is quite moral and who has got conscientiousness in this sort of way, and who obviously was brought up very strictly by his father, who was a Presbyterian minister. Yes, didn't he throw a telephone at somebody? Yeah, I admire that because I've often wanted to do that, but I've never had the guts. Yes, a volcanic temper, and yeah, yeah, but he's a human being. I mean, at least he's a human being. He's not a robot, is he? I mean, if I had a choice between him and Tony Blair, I know who I'd choose any day. Well, I just would. I mean, yeah. That's a very good question. In case you didn't get it for the tape, for the benefit of the tape, why do people not have this sense of good and evil anymore? It's interesting that it's very interesting. I think um, some people have had the sense of evil very strongly. I've had a very strong experience of feeling an evil presence, so we put it like that. One such was Henry James's father, William James or whatever he's called, who is brother. And if you want to read a evocation of evil at its most profound, the way to do it is through reading Henry James's greatest work, which is also his most accessible work, The Turn of the Screw. Have any of you read The Turn of the Screw? Um, it's it's a very ambiguous work. You really don't know what it's about, but it's evil. You know that something really nasty is going on in that woodshed. There isn't a woodshed. That's a quote from another book. But something. What happened since the time of Henry James when he wrote that was about 1895, something like that. What's happened is the banalization of evil and the industrialization of evil. And, you know, while one murder is dramatic, the murder of 6 million is just banal. It's just, you know, repetition, it's industrial evil. And I think it was Hannah Arendt, writing about the Holocaust, came up with this phrase, the banality of evil. And of course, the guy who was put on trial, she was talking about, what was the name of the guy who was put on trial in Israel, the only person to be executed in Israel? He was Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann. And Adolf Eichmann was basically a pen pusher, wasn't he? Yeah, yeah. Yes, he was the brains behind it, and he was the one who rang people up and saying, "Your train is late, and please get a move on," and so on. You haven't met your quota for the month, and so on. But when Adolf Eichmann actually visited the death camp, he threw up and had to be sort of helped away. Yeah, well, I mean, quite. I mean, and he was the banality of evil, and of course, you know, Stalin sort of lying in bed signing death warrants. You know, oh, that's another 300 or something. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah. There's also false consciousness, if that's the correct use of the term, in that we beat ourselves up for a whole load of crimes that we haven't committed. So a lot of people are going on, for example, about the police shooting people dead in England, where the police don't carry guns. And a lot of people are going on about slavery. And when, of course, slavery was abolished in Britain in 1834, I think, or something like that. And so none of us in in Britain have got slaves or have reduced people to slavery, and yet we make a big song and dance about a lot of things which are not actually actual questions. Yeah, modern say, yeah, absolutely. Nobody gives two hoots. I mean, the Uyghurs, there are 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, for goodness sake, and yet people are going on about nobody's interested. Nobody. So it's a moral dislocation that has happened because, of course, if you did get interested in the Uyghurs, you would have to do something about it. So you'd, for example, not be able to buy cheap Chinese goods anymore. Yeah. Uh, we have, for the benefit of the tape, we fall into the unexamined life, haven't we? As long as we're able to eat and drink and be merry, then a bit like the ancient Romans, we don't notice the bad things going on about around us. And so, for example, to give you a good example of that, we've got used to the war in Ukraine. Yeah, oh yeah, it's going on. There's nothing we can do about it. It's and then it seems we're edging towards, in fact, we've probably more than edged towards this idea that we must give Putin what he wants. And who the man who started the war? Oh, he didn't really start the war, etc. That, and so we got that sort of thing to sort of this. I think what we've got is a moral abdication, because morality is really quite hard, and it will cost us something. We like cheap morality, so it's great condemning slavery, but none of us have got any slaves, so it doesn't make any difference to us. It's great condemning police brutality and things like that, and so on. So, but it's cheap. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, I mean, we are like sheep who need a shepherd. And thank goodness we're members of the Catholic Church. We're part of the people of Jesus Christ, who is our good shepherd. May he lead us to the pastures of everlasting life, because we certainly need leadership. Amen. Shall we stop there? Whew.